In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
All right, welcome back, dear listeners, to It's Not Just in Your Head, a podcast about how the economic and political and social realms impact our internal, emotional, and mental lives. My name is Max Golding, LMFT, our licensed marriage family therapist out in California. We have Dr. Harriet Fraud here.
Hi.
Both hosts of this podcast. And today we have an awesome guest. But actually before that, because I think we forgot to do this in the beginning last time, so just a thank you to our patrons. So First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, Bandila MC Manga, Evan Lee, and Ashley, and Liam, who always does the editing and social media.
Yes.
Try to do that in the beginning to not forget to the end, since people listen more kind of in the beginning versus the end. Okay, anyway. So we have someone who I'm really excited about this, in part because I'm not a huge meditator or mindfulness person now, even though I've mentioned being like DBT trained, which we have all these stupid acronyms, dialectical behavioral therapy, but mindfulness plays such a huge part of that. And I did the Vipassana 10-day retreat years ago. And so I mindfulness has like kind of shaped me, and I think most of the younger generations of psychotherapists quite a bit. And but then being, on the left wing politically, discovering I haven't even said your name yet, Ron. Ron Purser, Dr. Ron Purser, who's the author of McMindfulness, is a professor of management at San Francisco State University. So some listeners may have already heard of McMindfulness. And he's written other books here too. You've written a lot, actually, Ron. But other than McMindfulness, which the subtitle is How Mindfulness Became the New Capitalist Spirituality, the Handbook of Ethical Foundations of Mindfulness, and the Handbook of Mindfulness, Culture, Context, and Social Engagement. And he's written for, we'll have the bio in the show notes, but he's, distinguished human. He's written for Tricycle, The Guardian, Salon, Alternet, and so on and so on. And also hosts a podcast called Mindful Cranks, which we didn't even know about. We'll be checking out. But anyway, it's an honor to have you, Ron. And we just want to ask you about things you've probably repeated all over the place, but
Yes.
Things about McMindfulness, but your general thesis around that and your opinions about the current kind of situation. So I more kind of browsed through and skimmed, didn't like deeply read. So sorry for that for McMindfulness. But it seems like it was a generally comprehensive critique of the current kind of mindfulness situation we have in the US and the West. So just for listeners who maybe are not familiar with this, what are the general arguments? What's this whole framework of the book? Yeah, what's it about?
Well, thank you, Max and Harriet, for inviting me to your podcast. I love the title of your podcast. It's quite provocative, so I'm happy to share here. Well, contemporary mindfulness began as a therapeutic practice, as a palliative for stress reduction. But more recently, I think it's devolved into becoming almost a narcissistic preoccupation with one's own happiness or for getting a competitive mental edge in business. So McMindfulness, it's kind of a code term for this sort of trend that represents a quick fix for the anxieties of late capitalist society. And it's been touted in the media for the last 10 years as this sort of universal elixir for improving just about anything, and whether it's one's career, relationships, even personal finances. But I was concerned because it became what was on offer was a stripped down, do-it-yourself self-help technique that was decontextualized from its original liberatory aims, and which were really to uproot the ego. And instead, I saw mindfulness becoming more instrumentalized and put in the service of the ego to achieve its desires and attain its goals. And now it's sort of even marketed as a means to attain happiness, which appeals to our really highly individualistic, entrepreneurial culture. So now it's all about me. And one of my colleagues who's in Brooklyn calls it mindfulness, MINE, because it makes all this it makes all these promises. It's all sort of self-centered on my happiness. And but to be fair, mindfulness does help people, and it has helped people with stress and chronic pain. But I think what my critique is really about, perhaps the unintended consequences, that it's also conditioning us to think about stress in a particular way. And I'll talk more about that, because I think it feeds into this narrative that we have about stress in society, that stress is an epidemic. It's like an inevitable given of just modern capitalist life. And because it's an endemic, it's up to us to get it under control and to adapt to it the best we can. So on the face of it, mindfulness sounds like a very empowering tool. But like your podcast, it ignores any source of pain outside of our heads, such as the capitalist system, which is exerting so much pressure on us. And the result of that, in a way, is to pathologize stress while offering a treatment that almost sort of tunes out anything that's not biological or psychological. So the ideological message is that if you cannot alter your circumstances, if you can't change the causes of your distress, just practice mindfulness. And
Well, if you can't, or because you can't.
Because you can't, right. So in a way, that's privatizing the sources of stress, which really kind of resonates with neoliberal sort of ethos. And it's a very seductive proposition. We're sort of promised that if we only practice mindfulness, and we get our individual lives in order, our dreams of securing happiness and attaining security and home ownership, social mobility, career success will naturally emerge. So it sort of has this expectation that we have this full control over our lives, our mental and emotional lives. So we like the self-mastery. And we could flourish, amidst the vagaries of capitalism. So I had a problem with that as I saw the rhetoric, over the years. On the other hand, mindfulness is heavily promoted because it touts its health benefits. So it's a very easy sell. It's very easily assimilated into our existing systems because it can function as a salvic force to help us cope with the noxious influences of capitalism. So that rhetoric sort of concerned me, and that's why I wrote McMindfulness, and that's why I dubbed it the new capitalist spirituality. Because it becomes sort of almost like the modern equivalent of a Protestant work ethic.
Wow. Could you elaborate on that? That sounds like a whole potential rabbit hole.
Yeah, could be. Well, the Puritan mindset, the Protestant work ethic, was that it was a religious sort of proposition that if you worked hard enough under very difficult conditions, that it would increase your chances into getting into heaven. I mean, Max Weber, the great German sociologist, wrote about this. And in a way, kind of mindfulness is similar in that it's kind of a salve against oppressive working conditions. That if we put up with those toxic working conditions, in exchange, we might be able to climb the corporate ladder, or at least maintain our marketability. And especially, you can see this in the tech industry. You can really see this in Silicon Valley, where we have a lot of spiritual entrepreneurs that sort of they've kind of bent the practice of mindfulness to serve corporate interest. So it's kind of a pseudo corporate spirituality.
How much? Sorry, this is like an off the cuff question, but how much? This is maybe an ironic way of putting it, but how much mindfulness do you think all of these people have who have created 50,000 different apps or centers or whatever. Because I think there's this belief system this is the hegemony, I guess, around us, right? That like, oh, well, if I just create this sort of technocratic fix to decrease the symptoms, then I've done good and I'm doing good and I'm healing people or whatever. I mean, how much awareness do you think there is in this world of the fact that this is like, it's not what they think it is, that it's like you create an app and people are still going to get evicted and not have healthcare and et cetera, right? I mean, do you think there's any awareness within this whole mindfulness entrepreneurial world?
Well, those people creating the apps are part of the tech elite, and they live in a bubble, and so it's kind of an irony because, I mean, take Google for example, which was the poster child for corporate mindfulness, and they kind of bragged a lot about how many engineers were going through their corporate mindfulness program. But I found it such an irony that these engineers were the very people who were exporting technologies of mass distraction while they were focusing more diligently on the code to produce these technologies of mass distraction. There's all sorts of ironies like this out there, but I think it's because the tech people in general live in a bubble, and they may really sincerely think they're doing good. I mean, I've met many mindfulness teachers that are very sincere, and I don't doubt their sincerity, but I'm a little taken aback by their lack of political awareness.
No, part of it does seem to me that the audience that they direct themselves to is not the 44% of people with low-wage jobs who are trying desperately and failing to make ends meet, but rather a professional group that has leisure time and wants to get ahead on a corporate ladder they're already climbing, not that the ladder is resting on their bodies. It's appealing to a different audience.
Yeah, I think you're right about that for the most part, that it's an elite audience. It's kind of a privileged audience to begin with, white, middle class, and although there's been some
black middle class.
Yeah, although we've seen recently, about a couple of months ago, in truthout.org, there was a very good feature piece on how the Amazon warehouses now have brought mindfulness to the shop floor. It was called Amazon, Amazon's wellness program, where they had these they look like kind of like porta potties, these little booths.
Yeah, I've seen this.
Yeah, where people would go in this kiosk and watch like a 3-minute video on mindfulness, and then go back and start working like a robot. But this craze is sort of, the notion of McMindfulness also comes from this idea of McDonaldization from George Ritzer's work, who's a sociologist, and he talked about the commodification of all aspects of life through the McDonaldization of society. And so with apps are sort of the epitome of that. Mindfulness apps are the epitome of that, because we see that they standardize and they so
I think sometimes, I've checked out those apps, and so, like I said, I was, trained in DBT, did the Vipassana thing and all that. So like I was kind of on the train for a while of just like, oh, mindfulness fixes everything. And like, got to tell everybody, you just have to like sit for 30 minutes and just sit still and feel, and like, it is, I guess on the one hand, it's like, how do you reconcile? Like, it is true that it's really good for you to just like shut up and sit down and like feel what you're feeling and notice, and and it like improves your focus and it actually from that more, I guess, if we're just going to talk about symptoms, or if we're going to do that Western thing of chopping everything up into smaller pieces, you look at the smaller pieces and you're like, yeah, it is helpful in the smaller pieces. But I guess I think like you've said, I mean, I've known a lot of meditators over the years now who well, I'll just say it like you were saying, it's a narcissism thing. Like sometimes it's just sort of like, there's this cure-all. It's almost the way people talk about like ayahuasca and stuff these days now too. I think we're sort of entering into a thing with that now as well. But like, well, if you just do this, if you do an ayahuasca trip, then like everything's different, like everything in your life, your whole perception. But like, how do you think this how do you think this happened? Like, because I don't know, 50 years ago, this wasn't a thing, right? So what, how, like, there must have been a historical arc, and like it must have come from somewhere, and then it had to have spread to where it is, right? So you must have studied that. How did this happen?
Yeah, that's right. Well, let me back up just a little bit, because I'll go back to the Buddhist traditions, and I use that with a plural because there isn't just one Buddhist tradition or school, but within various Buddhist traditions and schools, mindfulness was always situated within a much broader motivational and ethical context, with the ultimate goal of being liberation from the root causes of human suffering. And that was known as the cultivation of wisdom, by cultivating deep insight into the causes and conditions that led to suffering, both internally within ourselves, but also externally in the world. And so there was a very deep form of inquiry that informed mindfulness practice. It wasn't seen as a standalone technique or an ethically neutral tool. So what happened is that prominent promoters, they saw the utilitarian value of mindfulness, and this was probably in the 1970s or so, maybe 80s. They saw the utilitarian value and how it could provide individuals these therapeutic benefits. But in order to make it widely accessible to more secular audiences, they had to mystify mindfulness. And what I mean by that they had to use various rhetorical and discursive strategies to, in effect, cover up the fact that they were selectively extracting and uprooting mindfulness from its grounding in a very complex religious tradition with a 2,600-year history, which informed not only a foundation of morality and ethics, but, as I said, it was motivated to liberate the human mind from the causes of suffering and delusion, and to unleash a more non-dual way of knowing and being. So what happened then was that rhetoric, that mindfulness was presented as somehow some sort of universal quality or capacity. For example, John Kabat-Zinn, who started mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, he calls it the universal dharma, which is everyone's birthright. And that led many people to believe that they could have private access to the essence of Buddhism or the Dharma, independent not only of Buddhist history and culture, but even their own culture. So because it was reduced to an instrumentalized technique. And so what we see then is, by calling it something else like the Dharma, which is kind of ironic because the Dharma itself is a Sanskrit term for it comes from ancient Indian religions. But the bottom line is that the rhetoric was that we found, as Westerners, as good scientific Westerners, we know better than those Asians, and we found the essential heart of Buddhism, and it's no surprise, it's mindfulness. So by making that claim, it kind of created this sort of privileged fantasy that somehow, we could just drop into this universal method, which somehow has no connection to history or culture or any sort of context. And but this rhetoric has been going on for a long time. I mean, if you look at Westerners, the British, that when they first encountered Buddhism, they also sort of did the same thing. And the early study of Buddhist texts, for example, were kind of had a colonialist spin on them in terms of that we now know what the authentic Buddhism is because we have access to the original text. So that sort of played into also a couple other trends that were happening because Buddhism was sort of presented as more of a rational and scientific science of the mind. That was part of a movement that was coming out of Southeast Asia in the Theravada revival movement of the late 19th century, early 20th century. when British colonialism was threatening Buddhist religions in Thailand and Burma. And so what happened was that the elders, especially in Myanmar, Burma, they opened up meditation to the masses, which meditation was always something was done by an elite few monks. And they created a lay meditation movement more as a defensive maneuver against the British to try to preserve Buddhism. And once it became more modernized in that sense, then we see in the 1960s people that were in the Peace Corps visiting and then kind of discovering this more modern lay meditation movement. And that was the Vipassana teachings, which were then brought back to the United States in the form of insight meditation, which was even further modernized and psychologized. So it was a long process of modernization and medicalization and scientization that really created what we know now as modern mindfulness.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah. Jessica Dorr, who does a lot with the tarot and actually makes it very wise and sensible, has a differentiation which I think is so important here with mindfulness. It's the difference between being safe, which is the birthright of every human, and feeling safe. This makes you feel safe when you're not.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting parallel. Yeah.
You know, when you're actually in a rapacious capitalist society with endless exploitation, and you are not safe. And there is a there's an impulse within the therapeutic community and elsewhere, and Max and I, in our own little way, are trying to counteract that, of getting people to confuse feeling safe and being safe because we're not safe.
Right.
And by obfuscating that, these are other obfuscating techniques, and they're useful techniques for feeling safe in order to fight and in order to fight with your wits about you.
Yeah.
But not to be confused with being safe in a rapacious capitalist society.
Right. Well, yeah, that's exactly right. And so mindfulness has become refashioned in a way to accommodate to the needs of the market. And then what that does is it obfuscates more critical reflection on our systemic causes of our collective malaise and stresses in society. And I think that's one reason for that. It's become part of therapeutic culture, which has its own language in a way. It's situated, within a biomedical paradigm. So when you hear the term interventions, that comes from the biomedical establishment, which focuses on individualizing and medicalizing social phenomena. So it emphasizes a narrative of taking personal responsibility. Right? It's like we hear the words resilience and happiness and self-care. And so then we begin to see stress as nothing more than a result of poor lifestyle choices that we've made.
Yes, exactly.
And then we have biological explanations that are superimposed on that. So that's why it's become such a strong, you could say, let's see, Foucault had a good term for that, a regime of truth.
Yeah.
It become a regime of truth in society. We just take it as just the way things are.
Well,
last week we talked about a phenomenon which really does feed into this, the idea that we talked about with Jen Silva of millennials feeling that their fortune, even if they're working class, struggling and failing, is due to their family patterns, is due to their psychological inadequacy, without looking at that within a social context at all. That self-blame rather than looking outside. And in that, we're so different from Europeans, particularly the French, whose violence is social, not interpersonal like ours, and whose anger is at the social conditions that are destroying their lives.
Well, I also like what the British sociologist Nicholas Rose calls the side disciplines. And and the side disciplines, and this is exactly what you're talking about, use an institutional authority and expertise, right, to extend government in ways that individuals then become self-governing of their own behaviors. And so in this respect, the psychologization of society is so pervasive that we tend to have a particular way of thinking about ourselves. Like you say, we internalize what are many social and political and economic issues. We internalize them, and we tend to look psychologically at ourselves and that way. And
well, one. I mean, the kind of formal question that we were going to ask you too. This, how did the more secularized, medicalized, psychologized version of, essentially kinds of Buddhism and Eastern religion enter in? And you kind of already answered that. But because the thing that kind of makes me sad sometimes is like there's this sort of, there's a sad trajectory, I think, for the West and for, I want to say white people in particular, but not necessarily, of just, if you think of it basically from like the Renaissance to now, that there was this, it took a long time, but essentially this just a distrust toward like religious institutions of all kinds. This is something else we talked about with Jennifer Silva last week, of how there was a retreat inward, just even in the last 50 years or so, as the sort of neoliberal thing kind of got, all the big markers of kind of Reagan era to now, that because everything around everyone was failing, and now like there's no religious or spiritual grounding for, like millions of Americans and Westerners, that there's this sort of gap now, right? And then suddenly, if there's this thing that feels like it's spiritual, this, mindfulness and yoga and, putting up prayer flags and all these things. I mean, to me, it seems like a pretty obvious, there's the market forces, there's capitalism, there's individualism, but also as this sort of, it almost seems like a life jacket or something, I think, for a lot of people, like, oh, well, okay, there's something, I can do mindfulness. Right. I can go to a yoga studio, and it's like, well, I don't have to go to church and listen to these people lie to me, or, these like crazy people or whatever. I can just go, and then I can go inward. I can go into this sort of community of individuals who all go inward together. And that's where I'll find my spirituality, and I'll be sort of spiritually fulfilled. I guess it's just any reaction you have to that, but it makes me a little bit sad because, like you're saying, it's been so decontextualized from where it came from, that it's almost like, I guess it's what your book is. It's a capitalist spirituality, because it's not a spirituality, it sort of feels, it's this, I guess, it's a McDonaldized version of it, right? It's like, you go to the drive-through, you get your mindfulness, you drive away, and you're like, I got my I'm a spiritual person now, right? But does that make sense of like that gap occurred, or that void of spirituality, and then mindfulness kind of came in, and here you go.
Yeah, well, I think that here we have to look at this. And your book is wonderful in this respect, as part of what Althusser, the great French Marxist, called an ideological state apparatus. The apparatuses that discipline you from the inside, where the police and the army are not necessary,
right,
that make you feel, I won't go out, I won't see my spirituality in connection with all the people who are reclaiming this world and this society together. That connectedness, that spirituality of connection and struggle, I will see it as individual, and therefore I will discipline myself from the inside to keep calm, to not mind, to go back inside. And therefore you have a society like the United States, in which the ideological state apparatuses are enhanced by what was actually a politically powerful spiritual practice to be done together.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That's very Foucauldian in a way, because he talks about self-discipline and the technologies of the self and governmentality, the idea that, we learn how to govern ourselves by taking on these forms of discipline, and in a way, mindfulness, because it's a corporatist spirituality, highly individualistic spirituality, and it's kind of like shaping the ideal neoliberal subject, like you said. It's cutting off ties, anything to do with communal ties, solidarity with others. It really wants us to retreat into our private self, to go a little deeper into the interior, and that's where we'll resolve all our social problems. And so I don't see this as a mindfulness revolution at all. I don't see any revolution happening. Instead, I see it as a quietist surrender to the status quo. It's not a social movement.
Right. It's a personal move. It's led
primarily by elite upper class people with cultural capital. And despite all the evangelical rhetoric, it displays a remarkable conservatism.
Right.
But part of that is also a fault of the left in not acknowledging the spiritual connectiveness and elation of a movement, and of joining together to make things better for us all. That hasn't been developed.
Right.
That the import of that, even though it's felt in demonstrations, it's felt in even a strike where people will probably not earn back forever or for many years whatever they lost by being out and not being paid. But they have this sense of power and possibility. And I think the left has steered away from spirituality as if it were organized religion.
Right.
Instead of part of our movement.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to Max's question on that, because he talked about that gap and how, I mean, we've created these binaries, these oppositions between the secular and the religious. And obviously the religion now is considered bad, inferior. But the desire for transcendence has never gone away. And even though we have the decline of institutionalized religion, that hasn't erased that desire. And so mindfulness has kind of stepped into the void and become almost like a new secular religion in a way.
Yes.
But even secularism is becoming a new religion. But this backed by science approach is a move that troubles me, because now scientists have become our high priest in a way that we seem to need their blessings in order to do anything that's legitimate. And so by becoming the sole arbiter of legitimacy, we then create this dichotomy then between science and religion as well.
When all religion is all science, if you read Latour and Woolgar, Laboratory Life, or any of the others, the science that dominates because the politics of the laboratory allow it to. And it's not this objective thing. It's heavily politically inflected. And can't escape from the same pressures everything else is under.
Well, So, no, go ahead.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not anti-science. I'm vaccinated and everything. But what I'm talking about is just how it's really an act of power. It's an act of power in a way, which I don't know if it really serves our interest.
Well, this is, I think, a frustration I developed over time was, maybe to start here, because I even say this to clients. I actually train clients in like mindfulness, whether the GBT perspective or John Kabat-Zinn's thing. And I actually like there's like a 4-pronged definition where he says mindfulness is paying attention on purpose in the present moment without judgment, or maybe he does it in a different order. And I'll say that to people. And I'm like using my fingers. I'm like, so what's number one? What's number two? And like you actually get into, it's kind of a cool philosophical conversation. Maybe you could even call it a spiritual conversation when you start to think, well, what is the mind and why does my mind do this or that? And if you actually can think of, if we consider there are a lot of people in a lot of distress where you can, and I'll go back to what we were talking about in a second, but if you can actually get them to be able to self-regulate in situations where like it's almost like if they're in quicksand, or if you keep flailing around, you're going to fuck things up worse for yourself, right? And like, we need to get you calm and like functional in this like shitty situation you're in, right? So that's totally legit. But the thing that ended up frustrating me was, I think that because that ends up being the singular focus. I mean, there's never anywhere from mindfulness, CBT, DBT, the wellness industry, there's never a sort of there's never conversation about like, in service of what, like, what are we doing this for? Like who or what is there a higher power? Is there a community? Is there are there principles that we're in service of? Is there an organization? Is it the nation state? Like, what the fuck is this for? Is it for, and I think what it ends up turning, the only answer, I never really asked the question, because it would sound so, I don't know, I wouldn't be able to, in certain professional rooms, you can't say these kinds of things. Well, in service of what? Why are we doing this? Right. Because the answer would just be like, well, we're doing it in service of symptom reduction. There'd be a medicalized answer.
Symptom reduction, right?
Yeah.
That's what it would be, right? And they'd use different language, but it'd be symptom reduction, or it'd be like enhancing wellness, or it'd be like stupid nonprofit language or something. Sorry, I have very strong opinions about this. But to me, it's like, if you have a higher purpose, like, let's say, I'm really active in the local tenants union, and have been involved in like labor things, right? Kind of generic lefty person. And to me, it's like, I often wake up and I'm like, what can I do in service of the tenants union today? Right. It's kind of crazy for some people, right? But to me, it's because I feel connected to other people who are paying rent to slumlords and are struggling with that, and I feel a really strong sense of unification with them. And it's a sort of, it's a bit of a commie ethos. It's like me and the working class, right? Yeah. But I want to be functional and regulated and stuff in service of something like that, right? Like that's my thing. And I wish there were a lot more people who were. And I think something that can even be more confusing for people is if they don't have a framework, if their only framework is, if their sort of ideology is the self, that like, I just want to do, like, so self-care, right? I just want to do good self-care. I need to be better with my self-care. Like, they don't even have, no one's instructing them or guiding them toward in service of anything but their own self-care. Like, to me, that's actually, that's like maybe just destructive. Maybe that's too hard, but why would we just do certain things in service of our own individual health? Like, what? Like, that's actually a bizarre concept to me. Am I crazy for that?
No, I think it's
weird.
It's a very fragmented way of thinking about health.
In America, that is the only thing. You are
my
not,
health, my
exactly
self-care.
Your job, not the society.
My neighbors, my fellow citizen, whatever, other women, other men, other Black people, like whatever. There's just no, like, there's some pockets of collectivism in some places, or commitments, or whatever. But I think ultimately, and it's almost discouraged, though. I think that's the other problem, right? That it's because of how individualized, like the John Kabat-Zinn thing, paying attention. Okay, your selective focus on purpose. Oh, okay, you need to have intention with it. Without judgment, and then that's also this almost sedating effect. Like, you're just supposed to stay calm, like, don't speak up, don't get angry about stuff, don't think, well, there's an enemy, the employer is trying to rip us off or something.
Yeah,
like,
I'd love to elaborate on that at some point.
Yeah. Oh, please, I'm going off, so you gotta.
No. I just received an email yesterday, a matter of fact, from someone asking me this question. And the question was around counseling and psychotherapy. The person said that many psychotherapy and counseling practitioners seem to be gaslighting their clients into believing that it's their entire responsibility for a client's anxiety and depression lies within themselves. And I got this email, and I'll just read a few snippets from it. It says, when a patient or client tries to bring attention to these exterior sources of anxiety and depression, psychologists often label them argumentative. Or the psychologists are trained to write medical notes with phrases such as uncooperative with treatment recommendations, unwilling to perform recommended mindfulness activities. So I find that pretty wild. But I guess it's not uncommon.
That's pretty wild.
It's not uncommon, but I think part of that, and part of the reason that we are behind the rest of the world in many ways on this, is that we, in the 1950s, we crushed the two socialist parties, the Communist Party, and the spark of our union movement. So the ideological and economic and social underpinnings of the idea we're in it together was crushed. And Americans are only now beginning to emerge in the Black Lives Matter, in the Me Too movement, where it's not just individual, you are part of a group, in the union movements that are springing up all over to try to reclaim the sense of social participation in the problems we face. And I think we were particularly vulnerable because we crushed the collective element of our own well-being, which is if there's a problem together, only we can solve it. If we have to join with others because alone we're nothing. And our society is pegged, the ads are pegged for you to get the cream that'll make you attractive. You to do this, not the we, the you. And it's so politically and economically intertwined that this is a really important book, this McMindfulness.
Well, I'd like to come back to what Max was talking about, John Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness and how it operates in therapy. I just came across a really potent chapter by a therapist and also she's also a Buddhist practitioner, Kathleen Gregory. It's a chapter in a new book called Secularizing Buddhism by Richard Payne, who was the editor. And she makes a really interesting point that she sees mindfulness, or the modern mindfulness movement, that the aim of the practice has become psychological redemption. And she characterizes that as, like feeling and thinking and being better. And again, it's sort of the psychologized way of looking at ourselves. And that when it's taken up that way in therapy as an instrumental technique for self-improvement, it's usually to correct a deficit of some kind or some feeling that something's wrong or lacking in ourselves. So then mindfulness then, as a practice comes to be viewed as a way of generating or creating the right kind of internal mental space. So she argues, and I found this very, very insightful, she argues that stance towards mindfulness leads to a deepening split or dualism within ourselves, because it then takes on a form of becoming almost like hypervigilant, where we're self-monitoring and which can actually exacerbate the sense of isolation or separation from the world, because when it's seen as purely introspective or offering just private psychological comfort or a tool to enhance, it becomes seen as a tool like to enhance the efficiency of our autonomous self.
Right.
And it can reinforce a sense of isolation and individuality or individualism. So, because we think psychologically, we were talking a lot about this already, we then take ourselves as the object of scrutiny. So on the one hand, we split ourselves. We say, okay, I need these desired outcomes. I need to become more calm. I need to be less judgmental. I need to be more focused, my attention. And so then there's like this little inner monitor that's perched, closely watching our internal world to see if we have either the absence or the presence of these mental states that we're trying to create through mindfulness. And if we don't do it right, quote right, then we feel like that we failed, and we could become even more judgmental towards ourselves. It kind of creates this inner tension in a way, because we have like this subject or the observer or controller or commentator on the one hand, and then we have this other part of ourselves that, we've been taught that we have this like idealized image of being a mindful subject who is calm and collected and focused and non-judgmental. And then there's a gap between the actual and the ideal, which then could lead the person to being very judgmental and critical. They failed to pay attention. They got lost in mental ruminations. And, that can end up as interpreting it as a personal failure. They feel worse or more anxious even before they started to practice mindfulness.
Yeah.
And I think another issue, if you don't mind, is that there's this sense then, or this assumption that this perceived lack or failure as the cause means that somehow there's this assumption that there's this autonomous self.
Yeah, exactly.
Sitting behind our eyes that somehow can will into being the right mental states.
Well, and it is I forgot the author, The Untethered Soul. You probably know that book, yeah?
No, I haven't heard that.
Oh, really? I'm forgetting the author's name, but it's another one of those it was like it's in like all the yoga studios. You can buy it there. And it's like the first page or the first couple pages or something. The guy describes. It's a nice metaphor where you say, okay, so every day you're on autopilot, you're going around, and so who's driving the car, right? So what I'm going to ask you to do is imagine you're sitting in the back seat watching the driver do stuff, right? It's kind of a cool like mindfulness metaphor. And then from there, it's like John Kabat-Zinn has done this in like video interviews. He'll just like take his hand and he looks at it and he puts it behind his head and he's like, and I'm paying attention to my hand doing this and doing that. And having this sort of detached, almost in like trauma language, you call it like depersonalization sort of.
Yeah.
But you're sort of like zooming out of the self to observe what the self is doing. And I used to think it was like so profound, and it still kind of is, I guess, just to explain to people what are the terms like metacognition or it's a cool trick to sit there and it's a certain insight. It takes a certain level of, I guess, like self-regulation, and it's a skill, right? To be able to zoom out and say, oh, what am I automatically doing? I'm biting my fingernails or this or that. But I think in line with what you're saying, it ends up being this. You said somewhere in the book, it's just this preoccupation with like emotional states and self-regulation, where I could see once people get wrapped up in this, it just becomes there's an extra layer of almost neuroticism of paying attention to oneself and what they are and aren't doing, and trying to maybe make sure they're in the correct mental state. Like I shouldn't be, because if everyone's just doing things automatically, like no. Once you get this, once you infect your mind with this ideal that like, no, I need to be sort of observing what I'm doing while I'm doing it at all times. That's the correct state of mind to be in, right? Like I could see that as actually creating a sort of crazy making, and also an impossible feat. I mean, I would think that even the most like Buddhists somewhere in the mountains, like meditating all day or whatever, again, it's not in service of that. It's not like in service of the state of the hyper monitoring. It's in service of something bigger, right? So right. I don't know if that makes sense. It almost feels like there's been this virus, like there's been a virus that's been installed, I think, from this for some people, because it doesn't really go anywhere. Well,
what it can do, which is really ironic, is that Bertolt Brecht, in his trying to create the theater of alienation, and in some of his parables, uses that mindfulness that you've got to know what's going on around you. You can't, you have to pay attention. What's coming down at the same time as you are yourself. And he talks about driving on a mountain road and realizing he let his cigar go out because he was always smoking. Wouldn't be a good metaphor for now, but that you can't let your cigar go out. You have to look, will I fall down? Don't go to the edge. Watch out. Keep aware of your surroundings. So in that way, he uses mindfulness in the polar opposite way from, scrutinizing only your own feelings. It's knowing you are always in a social situation and you have to see what's coming down. So it's interesting that the way mindfulness has been used, particularly in the United States, as our declining empire is everywhere evident except in the news and the ads, that watch out, look what's coming down from the outside.
Yeah.
So you don't fall down into the chasm of ignorance.
I think maybe it's like there's an absence of an analytical framework in all these modes of mindfulness, right? That there isn't really, that again, if it's just sort of like I'm observing the sensations in my body and observing the light, what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing, and I'm I'm regulated and stuff, that it's an absence. I mean, I almost wonder, this maybe sounds like a stretch, but I've thought for a while that, like, from colonialism to just the history of how the West has done things, it's almost like, let's get rid of, like, culture, religion, like all these things that have been around for a really, really long time. Let's just create these sort of blank slate humans that, like, don't have a history. They don't see themselves as identified as having a history, a culture, really much of anything.
Society, right?
Unless it serves us in some way, right? Like, if we can sort of create a market demographic from it, and, like, yeah, they'll have them identify with that, but that's about it, right? That if you are this sort of blank slate and you're just like, I'm just this energetic being floating around and I just observe myself, then it's harder to develop an analytical framework, right? Of saying, like, well, I guess this is like war language, but, like, there's enemies, there's us and there's them, right? Like, if you want to go 99% to 1%, that a strictly mindfulness kind of framework sort of disallows that somehow.
Yes.
It, like, detaches you from that sort of socio-political consciousness.
It can. It's the because it's like every other wonderfully useful tool, depends on how it's used. Part of our job is reclaiming mindfulness, to say, what's coming down? What's out there? What is impinging on me? Who am I? And what is imposing on me from the outside? Which is what you do when you teach your kids to sit in front of the television and question the ads. What are they trying to do? We don't want that,
Well, maybe based on that, since we don't have a ton of time left, Ron, the reclaiming mindfulness idea, my understanding is you are a mindfulness person.
Mm-hmm.
You are like you come from the tradition in a way that's not the bad ways we're talking about, I think. What do you have any ideas on, like, reclaiming or how can it be done right, if at all, in this context?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't want to tell anyone how it could be done right.
Yeah. Here's how you meditate, kids. This is what you do.
One of the issues, I think, is as we're talking about, is that when mindfulness is used with the aim of, like, creating the right mental state, that automatically sort of sets it in contrast to one's everyday life. It's kind of already a separation between, okay, now I'm practicing meditation, formally, I'm sitting, and now I'll get off the cushion and now go about my daily life. And so that assumes, like, that mindfulness is still an instrument that can somehow be used to affect, our everyday life. But I don't buy into that perceived duality between the meditative mind and everyday mind. And so I think one of the issues is that when instructions are taken so seriously, that they could themselves become obstructions to meditation. Because meditation's not about the self trying to do anything. We're trying to let go of this sense of self, an autonomous self that has to do something. And so in a way, we want to get beyond the dictates of instructions. Now, I know we need to start somewhere. It's really hard to relax by telling people, okay, just relax. So, well, give me a technique to do that. Well, you don't need a technique to do that. So in a way, it's tricky. But you're talking about something a little broader than that. And I think what we've been alluding to all along is my friend Kevin Healy, who is a professor at the University of New Hampshire. He coined the term civic mindfulness. And that's a way of reclaiming mindfulness in a much broader way, which does not necessarily focus strictly on the individual. Does not strictly it doesn't exclude the individual, obviously, but it kind of recontextualizes, like you said, for a higher purpose. What is mindfulness for? We have to answer that question. And if we think it's only for ourselves, decontextualized, depoliticized, then we're just going to be useful idiots for the capitalist enterprise. the Greeks, even the term idiot was someone who was disconnected from the political. So I think there are ways to reclaim it. And I think you're already suggesting that there are these kind of reframing mindfulness is not just a do-it-yourself practice. It's not, there's an interesting article that just came out of the University of Buffalo recently. It made a lot of headlines. It was a research experiment done there by Michael Pollan. And basically what he found was that if people were already oriented towards being individualistic in nature, that if they took up the practice of mindfulness, it actually amplified it and made them even more selfish.
Oh, yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. So
yeah, it's crazy.
I think we're at a crossroads, like Harriet said, we're at a crossroads where we need to figure out ways that can bring back this more prophetic voice that we see, like in the Black churches, that the whole civil rights movement was the impulse was religious in many ways in terms of building community, building solidarity, working for justice, and we don't see that right now with contemporary mindfulness. We don't really see that happening that much.
Like with Martin Luther King.
Yes, with Martin
That's
Luther.
Spirituality and that context.
Mahatma Gandhi as well.
Yeah.
Mahatma Gandhi.
Yeah.
So we see a parallel here, I think, with feminism. It began as a radical political movement, but then it became co-opted.
Yes, it did.
And then it was defanged into empowerment and leaning in and all that crap.
And getting everything that men had, which is hardly ambitious.
Right. So it came right out of the neoliberal playbook.
Yeah. Gender only, which is detached from humanity, which is many, not two genders.
Right.
And only one counts.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, in a way, it's that when some people think of liberation as claiming the rights of the oppressor instead of the oppressed. Like the slaves should have been masters and slave other people. No, slavery's got to go. And that's a more spiritual idea. That it's the system that divides and conquers people. And we need unity.
Maybe we just need to get John Kabat-Zinn, and maybe if Marsha Linehan is still doing stuff, I think she's like not as much now, but all the mindfulness guru leader people, we just need them out on the picket lines and stuff.
Yep.
And they just need to do a lot of selfies and self promo and just say this is what my mindfulness has led me to. We must fight the bourgeoisie, there we go. That's all you need. Because also they're all thought leaders, they're just if John Kabat-Zinn's doing it, I'll do it, or Gabor Mate is kind of, well, he's not, I wouldn't put him in that same pocket, actually. He's pretty cool, but.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it kind of sounds then, Ron, like you're kind of saying, so mindfulness probably isn't the way toward collectivity. Then it's almost like we need the collectivity, and then you drop some mindfulness in there, right? You drop some spirituality into a spirit of solidarity, and then good things happen. You don't do the spirituality in absence of the collective, and then somehow
that's right. Not in absence. However, there is no right way to proceed. You can come from it from either way, but the idea is that there is a spirituality in connection, and there is paucity in isolation.
Yeah, it probably just goes. Oh, sorry.
It's and to have that unity, to have that connection between people, is not the capitalist enterprise. It's to isolate and sell.
Yeah. Well, and this is what Harriet always says this on the podcast, Ron, of just mental health is about connection. That's at the root, that's all it is.
Right.
I feel like that's. And I've repeated that mantra many times now, Harriet, but.
Yeah, but it's about connection in service of wider connection, because the Proud Boys are connected with each other in the service of fascism,
Yeah, I mean, maybe they meditate together too. I don't know. They put a little mindfulness app, and they get Gavin McInnes or somebody like a little recording he does about focusing on your breath.
Who knows?
Someone does like a German accent to try to sound like Hitler, and it's just like, just focus on your body sensations or something.
Well, civic mindfulness, as Ron said, is really kind of captures it in a wonderful term.
Yeah, and I think we also have to be careful that we don't privilege silence as much as we do, because if we want to move out of these highly individualistic practices to more social practices, then we have to allow critical dialogue to help build more collective attentiveness or collective mindfulness to the structural and systemic forms of stress and suffering. And so that way we can stop using mindfulness simply as an accommodationist tool. And if someone in therapeutic setting says, I was really angry about my boss, and instead of just telling them, well, maybe you should learn how to watch your breath. Again, maybe draw that out a bit.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, totally.
And like put it within the context of their social and economic lives,
Yes.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
And I like C. Wright Mills. I always like quoting him, and he was great. I think this is really, something very important, that, helping people connect the dots, right, between their personal troubles and public issues. And not everything can be reduced to some sort of psychological symptom or pathology.
Yeah. Do you have, since we're about at the hour, Ron, unless you have any pressing other burning thoughts, comments or whatever, just like things to maybe plug, like you could talk about your podcast, any upcoming books, anything you're involved in, or things that you would want people to pay more attention to out there in the world?
I have my podcast, The Mindful Cranks, going on episode 35, getting ready to post a new episode of the book. I interviewed Richard Payne for his new book called Secularizing Buddhism. It's kind of a critical look at that. And I'm going to be on an interesting TV show in the UK, sponsored by the Institute of Arts and Ideas or something like that, on the role of time in society. Wow. And whether focusing on the present moment is useful or not, something like that.
Wow, that's wild.
What's cute around that? The concept of time was developed with with capitalism, because time was money. Before that, the sun comes up, the sun goes down, you regulate. But time as a concept developed in Switzerland with capitalism.
Oh, yeah. There's a whole history of time, isn't there? I have a very good colleague who, she's a sociologist. She's retired now. She was at Cardiff University, Barbara Adam. And she wrote a ton of books on time and society and looking at that history. But no, this was great. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too.
Yeah, me too.
And I'm so glad for our listeners and our sponsors who made it possible. And of course, Liam, who records and erases and amplifies and is amazing.
Yeah. And Om. What is that, by the way, before we go, Ron? What's the Om? What is that?
It's an old Sanskrit chant. It's a syllable. I think it's usually symbolizes oneness.
Yeah. Well, oneness is a good idea.
Okay. All right. So, but I should do it by myself, right? Like alone in my room. So I can become more powerful and strong and superior to everyone.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. Enough. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Dr. Ron Purser. Everybody look up his info in the show notes. And thanks, everybody. And see you next time. By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.